on the web, there's this discussion right now. There's all kinds of discussions about unit testing. So right now what we've shown you isn't just unit testing. We've shown you unit testing with code coverage, with integrated reporting, which we'll show in a minute, and that stuff is pretty wild. There's all these different test types that go with it. There's all these different methodologies that are enhanced by it. So if we popped unit testing out of that and said no code coverage, no integrated reporting, and we stuck it someplace else, the question is, how valuable is that compared to if you could get all of this together? If you say, well, take it all and put it everywhere, well then now you're kind of
reasonable.
Now you're getting to a point. So I invite you definitely, if you're talking about blogging and whatnot, to think about that line, because a lot of this stuff is all about the integration paths.
The integration story is extremely compelling, but I think there is a happy medium there.
Okay.
We don't have that integration story
Yeah.
in Unit today right now, but it's still phenomenally useful.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be really great to push a very limited subset of features down into the base. So maybe you can't integrate it with code coverage and static analysis and all that stuff, but you have a simple standardized way of writing your unit test that's in Visual Studio. So maybe even if it's just the attribute set and a simple test runner, put that in academic division.
One more
Start getting people from writing in the habit of writing unit tests.
You need the skeleton, be able to do the code generation skeleton in there, because a lot of the people that are coming in here that don't have a unit testing mindset need to know how to get it done, and the ability to have that skeleton built for them by using the right-click menu on the class and say, I can't remember what the term was, but I think it was build test classes or something, whatever that was, generate test classes. That will go a lot further because they don't need to have the experience in the unit testing yet, but they can get the framework put in there and then let them go and put the real meat in.
Interesting. Yeah. So let's move on to the next part, because we have a lot more to go through, depending on how hungry you are for data. We can show you.
Robert's got 57 more minutes.
We'll hurry to get those 57 minutes on.
My wife's going to be pissed that I get home.
These dorks from Visual Studio, they stole the camera and they took me to this weird conference room. What can we do? Okay, so test-driven development. A lot of folks get confused on the web and they say, you guys don't have test-driven development in the product. Or they say, you have test-driven development, but I have to use it after I write the tests, because they've seen code generation, and they think that's the way we do test-driven development. And that's not necessarily the answer, right? Obviously, when we talk about test-driven development, the kind of purest view of test-driven development is, I've never written a class, and yet I've not written a single line of dev code. I start with my test, it finds a bug, I then go create the test or the dev code that kind of conforms to that. And so we went ahead and made that process available, because one of the things we said early on is that developers complain that a unit testing framework is too brittle to let them go down these paths of doing things like agile development. So we're going to actually show you how we do that. So test-driven development is generally just what we just talked about. You get a compile error when you write your code, when you write your test, because your test calls your dev code. You then go and you write your dev code. Now you have dev code that conforms to the test code. And if you haven't written the actual dev code, you guts the dev code, the test code will still fail. You've literally put your spec into the test. And then that forces the developer, or you as a developer typically do test-driven development, it forces you to go ahead and think about what the method will do before you actually go write the method, which is a good methodology. So what we expect to do is go ahead and show you that example of doing test-driven development really quickly. Want me to show you this?
I don't know why I'm here.
No. You have a big part coming up.
You've done all the unit tests.
Right, the unit testing stuff is pretty much, I present this at TechEd, we've made this demo pretty much for TechEd. Tom actually shows some of the more...
I hadn't seen these slides yet, so I didn't know what order you're doing all this.
Yeah, all unit testing first. Yeah, all unit testing first. So, let's go ahead and switch for the audience here. Cool. Okay. So here I'm going to go ahead and just kind of skip ahead. I'm going to go ahead and say we've kind of done some test-driven development or whatever, but now we're in a mode where I'm going to jump to my test, and I've looked at Persistence Data Manager. I'm the developer, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new test here. There is no dev code that corresponds to this. I'm just going to write a new test. So I'm going to start test method, right? Whoops. And public void.
Get them to give you the name.
Well,
New
I mean,
feature.
yeah, but let's say backup feature, because what animal does is it has an XML file, and there's no way to back that up. So we'll just say, let's go ahead and make that backup. So we're going to call it new backup test, right? Backup feature test, right? Yeah. Okay. Great. So here it is. So we'll go ahead and we'll take the code from just the new code from a previous test, just because I'm lazy and don't want to write that code. So there's my basic new. I've newed my dev class. That should basically work. I'll go to target dot. We see the different methods here. As a developer, I know that load data, persist data. I know what these guys do. Increment. I kind of get what these all are. But there's no backup. So I'm going to go ahead and say dot back up my data. Whoops. And we know there's no method called that. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I think it should take. I think I should take a string. Let's say my file name .xml. And because I'm crazy, I'm going to give it 3 ints. There. For me, that's useful. That's my particular test case, right? Pretty straightforward. That's the spec that we've defined. Should work for backing up the file. Now, of course, I'm going to go ahead and compile this. And what I'm going to get is an error. And it says, hey, Persistence Manager does not contain backup data, right? So I went ahead and created my test very straightforwardly. And I was able to go ahead and name a method that wasn't in that dev code that now tells me what I should go ahead and create in the dev code. Now, normally in test-driven development, what do I do at this point? I switch over to the dev code and I write this method. But instead, I'm going to right-click on this guy. I'm going to go to refactor. I'm going to say generate stub. And when I say that, I'm going to get an exception. So now, that didn't work out the right way. So let's try this one more time. Good stuff. Now we're entering the debugger, unfortunately.
We know what it was going to do. That's cool.
What do you think it was going to do?
It would have made the stub for that test.
It would make the stuff for the dev code.
For the dev code.
In
the
the
actual
methods,
method,
backup my data,
or whatever you called it, will actually be put into the actual dev
And
code.
did it reference back through the accessor to the correct project?
Well, it wasn't would have been fine. Would have been fine.
But if we were going through an accessor, does it know how to chase back through that?
Does it? I'm not sure what you're asking. I'm sorry.
If I were using an accessor.
And, oh, the private
Because
accessor?
it's good- right, I'm using a private accessor because my method is going to be a private method. So my test harness will have to go through the accessor to access it. Can I auto-generate a stub for that?
So, in order to do what you're talking about using the accessor we just showed
Right.
you for the private stuff.
Right.
And I want to go to the private guy, click that.
Right.
You actually have to go to the proxy class in the middle.
Okay.
Right, because your accessor is actually calling a proxy class in the middle that then calls your dev code, right? So you'd have to do that middle step yourself.
Right.
Today, the refactor doesn't do the proxy class for you, but at some point we hope it will. So let's just check out and see what exactly. Maybe we can show this cool guy one more time here. Let's see. I think we actually lost that particular method because we hadn't saved it.
Right.
So let's try it one more time here. Again, I think this is literally like today's build. So it's not even the tech ed bits. It literally is what you're getting, like what our dev team built today. So let's try this one more time. Yeah. It's cool enough to try it one more time, Risk the issue here. Public void my new backup feature, or backup test, yep. And very quickly, grab this guy. Yep. Target dot and my new backup string. That will make it more realistic test-driven development. There we go. There we go. Let's compile this guy. Okay, we get the the backup data there. It looks like we actually have the old test. We're going to go ahead and just delete that out. Just because it was bad luck and killed our process last time. Okay. Everyone take a deep breath. Hang on there with me. Let's see what happens here. Okay, so didn't blow up. We see Persistence Manager has changed. We click there. We see My New Backup Test. And we have the string, the ints, and we went ahead and have not implemented feature.
Right on.
Nice.
So now I go back to my particular build process. I build. Now, of course, everything builds because we went ahead and created the code for us. We drop down to the test, my new backup test. We select it. We click Run. And we go ahead. We say OK to the run configuration. It fails. And what we see for the error is that system not implemented exception because I haven't actually went and implemented it. So not only do we have a framework that's in the unit testing stuff that's basic enough to let you do test-driven development, we actually have tools like refactoring that help you do the actual building of that particular test-driven framework.
So bring up that refactor menu for a second. Please.
There we go. Cool. So that leads us to our next segment very quickly. Tom, do you want to go ahead and switch the slide for me?
Sure.
So we can talk about it a little bit. So the next set, and then we're actually going to skip ahead and just show you wholesale. We're going to let Tom talk about the remaining test types, and then we'll get actually into the last part of the presentation, which is more about some execution stuff. So just the next point about your unit tests. I've written all these unit tests. We've generated some. We've done some test-driven development. We went ahead and created some tests. We've done all this. Now the question is, how effective is it? And as you can guess, we've talked about integrated code coverage. So integrated code coverage literally lets you get in as a developer or as a white box tester and see what lines of code are actually covered and which lines aren't. So we talked about in the beginning, I went through all this process of using unit tests and learning the framework. What do I get for it? Code coverage can actually show you in graphic detail exactly what you get and what lines are tested and how effective those tests are. So when we talk about code coverage, we talk about, it's not really about the quantity of tests, right? I mean, it's kind of a nice saying. It's about the quality of those tests. So, it's all about not having 10,000 tests, but actually how effective those are against your dev code. How do you measure that? So let's look at that one more time. Okay. Yeah, afterwards, all these, it's so cool. We're going to have to put those on camera and show them individually to all the MSDN guys, Look, they did say it was so cool. Look at that. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to select all of our tests very quickly. Notice I'm doing this all from the development environment. I haven't even switched really to, if I had 10,000 tests, how would I manage that? We'll show you that in a moment. But if I had, just a few, that's how we're using the basic development environment. So I'm going to click play. I bring up the run configuration stuff. We always talk about this run config tab. So in the run config tab, or in the run config dialog, we talked about code coverage. We're going to enable code coverage. We're going to go ahead and look at some of the binaries. Do you know which guy's the best guy to select here?
I don't.
You don't? Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and take a couple of chances here.
Well, your test is based on animal.guts, right?
That's right. So let's just grab that guy.
Debug.
Add that guy on. And this dialog obviously is getting better. Like this was the basic dialog we shipped in TechEd, and we're actually making this dialog a little bit easier to use. So we're going to go ahead and say OK at this point. We notice the tests are now all pending. So they're all trying to run. Now, like I said, this is today's build. So if I selected the wrong DLL, it's very likely those tests may not actually all the way get finished. While this is trying to run, we're going to go ahead and turn on the code coverage window here. And if I had to guess that it's taking this long, I might guess that it's not going to work.
No, because the little string just changed from test run pending to test run completed.
Okay, so you're going to have to bear with us while we turn on the right DLL here. So we're going to go ahead and hit this again. Code coverage, we're going to enable it. And we're going to try that guy, I think. Yeah.
This will get much smarter too.
Yeah. Hopefully we can get these guys to run. Unfortunately, the way that dialog works in the most recent bits, it's just broken as we're going through the most recent milestone. Do what?
I said it may not be working in this build.
No. Bummer. Try one more run here. Yeah. So unfortunately, it's not working in this build. So we have it on my laptop as well. Maybe at the end, if we come back, we'll actually show the code coverage and stuff working. But in general, you'd run this and you can actually see the code coverage data itself. I apologize for it not working. So it's just the daily build. So we'll come back to this and try on one more laptop before we get done, because I do have the tech ed bits that this was working in, rather than the daily build that we have to just use for this particular point. So do you want to jump into actually showing them the rest of the test types while I'll talk them through it while you drive?
So,
Start with manual and just work your way down.
all right, can do. Okay, so in addition to unit tests, we've also added other test types. And again, I've got the My Test project that we created, and I just simply go like I'm adding anything to a project. I right-click on it and select Add New Item. And in my New Item dialog box, this is specifically a test project type. And so I've got the unit tests, of course, but I can also create manual tests. I can also create load tests and web tests. I'll go ahead and show you a manual test. The general idea of the manual test is that when I click Add, it brings up just a very simple template for me to fill out, and you'll notice it's been added
I'm going to
down
minimize
here.
Visual Studio a little bit to bring it back.
Just all right. So I've got my manual test showing up over here, but you'll also notice that down in my test view, manual test shows up just like any of the other tests. And then once I start getting more and more tests, I can start doing such things as group by, like if I wanted to, I could do test type, and so that I can see all my unit tests, all my manual tests, things like that. When I go to run my manual test, it looks just like any other test run. As a matter of fact, I can select other test types at the same time as running a manual test. And it shows up initially as pending. So what I do is I actually double click on it to get it to run, and it'll bring up exactly the same template as I had before, but then I could select pass or fail as far as when I step through these. So again, the manual test is just the human thing where I can't write a unit test for it, I can't write automated tests for it, so I at least have a solution for it for doing a manual version of it. So I selected that it passed, I clicked apply, and now you notice that down in my test results window it's passed. So we're trying to have that same metaphor for everything, where everything shows up in my test results window, and that's our solution for doing manual tests. Now, some of the other test types we have, let me show you doing a web test. So again, I come in, do a new item, and I'm going to select web test as the type that I want to create. I'm actually going to record a web test. And I'm just going to go to the Microsoft site. So when I go and tell it that I want to add a web test, it brings up an instance of Internet Explorer, and I can tell it where I want to go to start my testing. So you notice as I'm clicking through, let's say I'm clicking on the Windows Plus packs, as I'm clicking through and selecting stuff, you'll notice it's actually adding information down along the left-hand side of exactly what I'm typing in. I can also type in Visual Studio Whidbey, for example, click go. And so I can record queries that I'm submitting as well. And I can see more information. It actually shows me everything that was submitted as I passed it. So that's good enough to start with for my web test. Let me save it. And you notice that as I save it, I come back into Visual Studio, and it's exactly what I recorded earlier. Okay, so the next thing I can do is, now that I've got this web test created, I can actually step through it one line at a time and verify that it's running as expected. So I can click the Run button, and I can step through here. Let me give ourselves a little more room. And scroll that down a little bit. And I can step through it, like I said, one line at a time. Doggone it. We don't have the proxy stuff set up correctly on this either. Okay, so if we had the proxy settings set up correctly, where it was working with our internal site, or actually that was our external site, then what you'd...
You can also make a new one, good MSW.
Well, yeah, let me try the internal site and see if that makes
Just
any
like
difference. And new item, record a test. So, like Jason said, internal site, see if that makes any difference. Get rid of this one. It's taking forever to bring up our internal site. There we go. Alright, same idea as before. As I click through, it's keeping track down along the left-hand side, everything that I'm selecting. Cool. Find out more information. Alright, so, good enough. Let me go ahead and save it. Wow, what is going on? We got a bad daily build or something, because it's not now saving. Okay, let's try this one more time. I don't like demoing the stuff that's not working. One more time. Industry news. Company overview. I'll just save. I won't push my luck. I'll just save. Okay, that one worked. So the idea here is that once I've got my web test created, I can go in and I can step through it one line at a time. And again, hopefully, no, it's not. I'm getting weird authorization errors.
But you can definitely see we're stepping through.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, it lets you step through. In addition to that, it'll also render it so you can see exactly what the page is that you're testing. You can also see the response or the request that I'm sending off and the response, the exact response that I'm getting back. So you can see that how helpful that is. And then
Say again?
That'd be so good for tinker detection. You can actually check the input validations on code that's going in there and actually test against it.
Absolutely.
it's huge to be able to see that kind of response coming back. And then, of course, the rendering that comes back with it. So we've got the test created. One of the other things that you can do is, we don't have the database set up on this machine, I'm sure, but you can actually, if you want to do the type where you're doing some load testing, or if you want to step through and do it for a different type of data, you can actually tell it to add a data source. And I can go in and select which data source, which database that I want, and I can, if I'm typing in, an order form, first name, last name, and so on, I can pull from a data source and bind that directly to the information that I'm posting, to the query string that I'm sending off. So I can do a data-driven type of testing on this. Okay, so once I've got my test written, that's weird, I just lost my network connection. Once I've got this this type of test created, I can then go and create what's called a load test.
Can I run processes on the returned HTML so that I can run it through an XSLT or some kind of a comparison to check whether it's valid? Or what do I do? What happens after I step through it? Is there anything that's determining whether what I'm getting back is valid, or is this to step through the page behind code?
It's basically stepping through your standard rendered web pages. I'm not completely sure that I'm understanding the question.
So, in other words,
all we're doing is just basically recording the simple web requests that we're sending off, and then dealing with what we're getting back.
So when the data comes back,
Yeah.
and so you weren't seeing a web page because there was some
Right.
configuration problem. But
Right.
assuming that the web page came back, presumably I want to part of my testing is verifying that the web page that came back
Sure.
passes some test. So, and presumably I'm doing that test not visually, but on the HTML
Right,
that's
right.
coming back. So, is there some kind of a test harness that I write?
There are actually some
on-
verification points that you can put in. You can verify that a specific link is in place, a specific image was displayed, things like that. So you can actually put in verification points to check that you're actually getting the right page back, so that you're not just sending off these requests, hoping for the best on what's coming back. Let me show you guys what it looks like as far as the load tests. So the general idea of the load test is I've got my web test created. Again, it's the same idea as before. I can just add it like any other item. It shows up. I did that right. Right, there we go. I select the type of test I want to create, and it walks me through a wizard. And the nice thing about this is that in the past, you had to know a lot of information about creating a load test, what things to look for, and all that. In this case, it makes it really easy. I can select any of the type of automation tests that we have. So you notice I've got the web tests as well as the unit tests, and I can run load tests using any of those automated test types. So I click OK, and the next thing that you'll notice is, again, I lost my network connection, but it'll come back soon enough. I can add all of my different tests, and then as I add the different tests that I want to create the load test for, I can tell it what percentage to run for each of those different test types. So I can have 50% of the requests are running specifically for web test 3 and so on. In addition, I can control exactly how it's working with the browser. So there are a couple of things that we did when we recorded the web test. One was it recorded all the pauses that I was taking as a real user. If I don't want to go with that and work with those think times, I can actually have it normalize it a little bit so it kind of evens it out. So if it took 15 seconds on one page, then I can actually have it use more of an average. I could also tell it not to use think times. Whether it's caching, whether it's using session cookies, there's all kinds of settings you can go on from here. In addition to that, I can also tell it to simulate different types of browsers. So I could add another one and do Netscape and IE, and I could also basically say that I want to do 85% of it is IE6 requests, and the remaining percent is Netscape or whatever other type that we're supporting. So I'm just going to do IE for now because that's the only one that works at the moment. In addition, I can do the exact same thing you just saw, except I can do it for bandwidth simulation. So I can say I want this much from LAN, this much for T1, for DSL, 56K. So I can go through there. Again, I'm just going to do LAN for right now. All right, and this is this. Now this is really cool. This is where it's a very simple looking page, but what's really cool is I can come in here, and this isn't going to work unfortunately because we don't have the web server name. But what you do is if I know the name of the server that I'm actually running my web or my web server on, my IIS and so on, I'm just going to type in some name here. I can then tell it exactly what I want to collect. So I want to collect ASP.NET information, I want to collect IIS information, and then it basically takes all these default settings that we figured out based on our server products. We already know what we should be looking for. Wow. In addition to that, we've got I can control exactly how the load is taking place. I can do a constant load where it's always 200 users right out of the box, or I can do it where it's stepping up, and I can say I want to, for every 10 seconds that goes by, I want to jump up another 10 users until I hit 200 users. That way I can get 10 users get into the website a little bit, they've logged in, they've started placing orders before the next 10 come along, as opposed to 200 trying to log in at the exact same time, which is a valid test, but you may want something where it's a little more realistic. Yeah, absolutely. The last part is where I can actually go and tell it where I want to store the results, and then of course what Jason was pointing out, I can control the run duration. Okay, so let me go ahead and run it, and it's gonna be actually kind of weird. Actually, I created it. I'm not running it yet. Now there are a couple of things I want to point out here. Is that so all the stuff I just went through in that wizard, everything's been generated here to allow me to. I can tweak it from here, but the wizard made it really simple. In addition to that, I've got a couple of things here called counter sets, and as I drive down into some of these things, like processor, for example, I can tell it exactly what I want to watch for as I'm running the tests. And you notice here that we've got a threshold, and let me bring up the properties window for this. We've got this threshold rule compare constant. So the idea here is that we're underneath the processor time measurement that we're tracking as we're running the test. And I can tell it that I've got two levels of threshold warnings. The first one is, well, a warning. So if I hit 70% on my processor usage, I want it to let me know about that. But if I get to a critical level, whatever that is, in this case 95%, I need a higher level warning. Okay, so you can go through and you can tweak all that stuff from there. Same idea with your run settings and things like that. I'm going to go ahead and run it. I have no idea what's going to happen.
We know it's going to fail, but it's not going to actually run, right?
It's going to make some requests, but the general idea here is as it starts running and making these requests, it will actually start charting it. It's very similar to perfmon. So as I'm going through here, again, it's not going to run because we didn't really have anything valid to run. It starts charting everything, and I can click down and select all those different counters we just saw on the previous page, and I can drag over what I want to watch, and that's what shows up on this
We'll show you
graph.
a slide that shows this actually filled out, but now you can see the bits. It's just that we don't have it. We set it up like right now, rather than having an hour or something to set this up. It took us like 2 seconds to set it up.
Right. So
Cool.
yeah, it's not.
Okay.
Keep it in that state.
Thanks, Tom.
Is that it? What other test types were there?
I think. Yeah. Moving right along,
I
we
know
don't want to run out
one
too
other
much
one that was
tape.
coming to mind was that we have external partners can't create their own test types in there. And the one we had was CompuWare.
So I wanted to actually, because we made such a big deal out of it, we tried to show code coverage. I just turned on my laptop using the bits we had from TechEd. So now I'm going to go ahead and click play. I'm going to go to code coverage. I'm going to enable it. You can see it's the same animal project we just had. It's just these are the TechEd bits rather than today's build. And I'm going to add the binary like we did. We're going to run. Now we're going to see that at the bottom, instead of it just sitting there and saying pending, we're actually going to see it say test run in progress. And we see it kind of going a little slow, getting failed, inconclusive, as it's actually running the test that we just generated, right? I'm now going to look at the code coverage window, and now when I expand that window out, we now see that certain things were not covered 100%, certain things were covered 68%. We can kind of scroll down and see that we had like 94% not covered, 5% covered, just so a lot of not covered stuff, but some partially covered classes. Particularly the persistence manager, which we did write some tests against on Tom's machine. On my machine, I just generated some tests very quickly. I'm going to click that. I'm going to look at the load test, or look at the load list method that we wrote a test for. I'm now going to go ahead and turn on coloring. And now I actually see the code that is green is the code that I did hit. The code that's red is the code that I actually missed. So in this case, I actually hit everything in the green, and I missed the actual catch of the exception, so I understand that. As I scroll closer to the top, I see I actually partially hit this new XML serializer. I missed the lines underneath that, but I hit the catch, because probably that line threw an exception, which then was caught, and we actually hit the throw code. Right? So here, I can see that though I did test the method, persist data, I missed the core of the actual method. So if I were writing a test against this, and I thought I had written a good unit test, now I realize, oh, I've actually missed the actual lines of code that I wanted to hit, and this tells me exactly what I could go and write my test against, and where to begin to investigate. So literally, it does work in our builds, we promise. It's just that in the daily build today, it was broken.
So do you have a best practice or something that you recommend for dealing with getting into the exception handling code?
Yeah, we have these, we can do things like throw known exceptions, and we have this, catch known exceptions. So if your code does throw known exceptions, we can catch it and we won't count it as a failure. We don't have fault injection where we can force you to hit that particular exception, but in general, I mean, if you're writing the code, it depends on how granular you want to get. You could write the code to force the exception if you'd like.
You can write it in your test.
That's right. So I mean, at some point we might get into fault injection, but it's not something we're doing today. Hopefully, maybe a partner will help us out.
Yeah, no, I was asking more just whether there was a best practice for doing the injection, not whether it did it for you.
Not at this point.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to go into kind of hyper speed here. We've been taking a lot of time. We don't want to run out of tape. So we're going to go kind of fast. So generic tests, we've mentioned those. And we talked about the idea of taking an existing test, wrapping it in a generic test case with our metadata, and suddenly you can run that generic test. So what that means is that Visual Studio creates an execution process. That execution process normally is the test we run. But in a generic test case, we actually wrap your test, and so then your test actually then gets its own test process. So literally speaking, Visual Studio runs the execution process, which then reads the metadata and launches your test in its own process. And you can write the little shim code that helps do that. But the point is, with a very little amount of code, you can write an existing test. Of course, the interesting scenario isn't just I wrap one test.
That's nice, but not the most interesting. If I have an existing test case I really want inside Visual Studio, that works. What's cooler is when I actually have a generic test process that's like a harness. I have an existing harness today that runs from the command line. I fill that command line in as a set of metadata, and then we run that generic test process, which then runs these generic tests, and we report those results back to Visual Studio. So literally, someone asked earlier, can I go ahead and wrap a known test harness? And the answer is yes, you can, and then all those results can show up in Visual Studio. You can launch it from Visual Studio, and you can get the results inside Visual Studio.